New York is notorious for tough gun laws, so it's common for people to ask, can I legally carry a gun in New York? The very short answer to that question is yes, you can, so long as you have the proper permitting. That said, there are exceptions to when you can legally carry a gun. On top of that, there are many different sorts of permits, and additionally, New York City has its own permitting process that gun owners must go through to legally possess a gun inside of New York City. Gun laws are very complicated in New York, so if you've been charged with a gun offense, it's important to speak to an attorney who's experienced with gun charges and who can assess your unique situation. With that caveat out of the way, I'm going to broadly go over the gun laws in New York State, as well as the gun laws in New York City. Before I get into the general licensing requirements for possessing guns in New York State and New York City, I'll first mention locations where guns are not allowed, even if you have a permit. For obvious reasons, these restrictions don't apply to law enforcement. So you're restricted from carrying a gun even if you have a permit in the following sorts of locations: courthouses, bars, restaurants that serve alcohol, national parks, state parks, roadside rest areas, libraries, hospitals, schools, and also certain designated sensitive locations. So for instance, Times Square is one of those locations. In addition to these locations where you can't possess a gun even if you're licensed, there are also kinds of weapons and kinds of ammunitions that are banned even if you do have a permit. Some of the banned items include assault weapons, magazines that carry more than 10 rounds of ammunition, ammunition that's armor piercing. So there are many different kinds of ammunition and weapons that may be banned, and if you have been charged with a crime, it's worth speaking to an experienced attorney who can assess whether or not your weapon was banned even if you had a permit to generally carry a firearm. I'm now going to discuss the licensing requirements in New York State. Although New York City is obviously New York State, I'm not including New York City when I talk about New York State gun laws, because New York City has separate regulations that apply to possession of guns in New York City. In New York State, you don't need a license to possess a rifle or a shotgun, so long as the rifle has a barrel of at least 16 inches and a shotgun would need to have a barrel of at least 18 inches. To possess a handgun in New York State, though, you do need to obtain a permit. Prior to the 2022 United States Supreme Court decision of New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, it was very difficult for most people to get a license to carry a handgun or a pistol in New York State. To obtain a license which would allow you to carry a pistol or a handgun, before that United States Supreme Court decision, an applicant needed to demonstrate a special need for protection that was more than just like a general desire for self-defense. In other words, a person had to articulate why they had a unique risk that warranted them possessing a firearm. So, for instance, people who might commonly receive death threats, like say celebrities or politicians, those are people who have a specialized need, and they, prior to the United States Supreme Court decision of Bruin, those are the sorts of people who would be more likely to get approval for a handgun license. However, after the Bruin Supreme Court decision, applicants don't need to cite a specific threat or reason why they're uniquely at risk to get a handgun license. That said, New York State did respond to the United States Supreme Court decision by creating a few additional requirements to get a handgun permit. And some of these things include mandatory training, character references, and disclosure of social media accounts for several years. It's important to note that even if you're licensed to possess a handgun in a different state, New York State doesn't grant reciprocity. So you can't possess a gun in New York State, or New York City for that matter, even if you're licensed to possess a handgun in a different state if you don't have the applicable license in New York. Although federal law allows people to transport guns through states even if they don't have a license for a particular state, You should be certain to store your gun and ammunition in separate locked containers that are not within reach of you while you're driving through the state. So, for instance, let's say you're licensed to possess a gun in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, and you need to drive through New York State to get from Pennsylvania to Massachusetts or vice versa. You should be sure in that situation to make sure that your guns are unloaded first, and also that they're in locked containers and the ammunition is in a separate locked container. And all of those containers need to be outside of your reach while you're transporting your firearms through the state of New York. In New York City, you need a license to possess any sort of gun. For instance, although you don't need a license to possess a rifle or a shotgun, you need a license to possess those in New York City. New York City gun licenses are issued by the New York City Police Department. So New York City Police Department issues these licenses, but it's not just like one sort of license that they issue. There are many different sorts of licenses that the NYPD will issue. So if you have received a license in New York City, you should closely examine the terms of your specific license so that you can thoroughly understand where and where you're not allowed to legally possess your firearms. It's also worth noting that a New York City gun license doesn't allow you to carry guns outside of New York City. So if you have a New York City gun license and you want to take a handgun to upstate New York, you're going to need to get a separate license for New York State in order to do so. So as I mentioned, there are many different kinds of New York City firearms licenses. Some of the common ones are a premise license, a carry business license, a limited carry business license, a special carry license, and a carry guard license. Those are some of the common ones available in New York City. If you've been charged with a gun crime in New York, give me a call for a free consultation. I can assess your case to determine the best path forward.